Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, November 29th. We begin tonight with the state of the country's economy, which is continuing to show modest growth. Statistics Canada says the Canadian economy is getting slightly stronger. It's growing at an annualized rate of 2.9% in the third quarter. On a quarterly basis, real domestic product increased by 0.7%. The results beat out the federal agency's preliminary estimate for growth, which was 0.4%. The agency reports that household spending fell for the first time since the second quarter of 2021, slipping 0.3%. All right, turning to a major acquisition by the Royal Bank of Canada, which is going to buy the HSBC Canada in a cash deal worth $13.5 billion. RBC Chief Executive Dave McKay says the deal positions RBC as the bank of choice for commercial clients with international needs, newcomers to Canada, and affluent clients. RBC says it expects to close the deal by late 2023. Meanwhile, agriculture groups in Canada are applauding the long-awaited Indo-Pacific strategy from the Liberal government. The plan includes more than $2 billion, with a dedicated $244 million going towards improving trade. Producer groups say that's good news for farmers because it could lead to Canada striking more free trade deals. Canola Council of Canada President Jim Everson says he thinks the strategy can bolster existing trade deals, making life easier for farmers and Canadians as a whole. The Parliamentary Budget Officer says the Liberal government did not show fiscal restraint in its recent fall economic statement. Yves Giroux told MPs at a House of Commons Finance Committee Monday evening that Ottawa is spending a significant portion of the new fiscal room it has this year. High inflation and the COVID-19 recovery have boosted government revenues, resulting in a lower than projected federal deficit. But the Liberals have earmarked about $52 billion in new spending out of the $81.2 billion in new fiscal room since their spring budget. Canadians appear to be cutting back on their use of plastic straws and grocery bags, with a national ban on those items on the horizon. 3 weeks from now, it will no longer be legal in Canada to manufacture or import most plastic products. This with the sale of those items also being banned in the following year. Negotiations towards such an agreement internationally are underway this week in Uruguay, but they are expected to take at least 2 years to complete. Moving to Toronto now, where a school board northeast of the city is dealing with the aftermath of a cyber attack, canceling online classes for a second straight day. The Durham board also says it is postponing a provincial secondary school literacy test after what it has called a cyber incident. It says there is no timeline for full restoration of service after it shut down its network on Friday when it learned about the incident. In Montreal, the Anti-Radicalization Centre is embracing a series of changes since it opened in 2015. It no longer occupies the same spacious offices, and it now has a much lower profile and a lower budget. The center's focus has also shifted, with researchers moving away from studying radical Islam. They instead are looking at the far right and conspiracy theorists. The center's scientific and strategic director says the fear of young people leaving for Syria was the spark that led to its creation. But it was never meant to be the whole mission. Soccer's global governing body opened a disciplinary case against Croatia today. Croatia fans were taunting a Canadian goalkeeper, Milan Borjan, which led FIFA to open the case at the World Cup. FIFA says the charge against the Croatian Soccer Federation was due to the behavior of its fans. Milan Borjan was born in an ethnic Serb region of Croatia that was part of the conflict that split the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. The Weather Network is forecasting a colder than normal start to winter across most of the country. The network's winter outlook says a La Niña event will return for a rare third winter, which likely means colder and snowier weather throughout December. The network's chief meteorologist, Chris Scott, says January and February will offer some respite from the front-loaded winter as spells of milder weather transition between western and eastern Canada. Curling Canada is looking for a new title sponsor of the Canadian Men's Curling Championship. The 2023 Tim Hortons Brier will be the last time that the coffee house and restaurant chain serves as title sponsor of the annual competition. Carolyn Canada says in a news release that it is seeking expressions of interest, starting with the 2024 playdowns. Tim Hortons first sponsored the Brier in 2005 and has been a partner with Curling Canada since 1996. All right, Forum Daily will return after the break with a look at food bank use numbers from Feed Ontario. We'll have our interview with Carolyn Stewart, Executive Director of Feed Ontario, up next, so stay with us. Forum Daily will be back. A group of organizations says Ontarians visited food banks a total of 4.3 million times between April 2021 and March of this year, which is a 42% increase from 2019. Feed Ontario's annual hunger report found that more than 587,000 adults and children used food banks in that same period. Now, that's a 15% increase. Feed Ontario is blaming employment issues, inadequate disability supports, the pandemic, high inflation, and the rising cost of living. It's calling on the province to invest in housing and improve social assistance. Well, joining us now to tell us more about this is Ms. Carolyn Stewart, Executive Director of Feed Ontario, which is a collective of 1,200 partner food banks. Ms. Stewart, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you so much for having us.
Now, what's interesting here is that food banks were started as a temporary measure about 40 years ago in response to a recession in the 1980s. So tell us a little bit more about how food banks have evolved and their current presence in Canada.
Yeah, I think ultimately some of the statistics that you've already shared should be concerning to all of us. Food bank use has been on the rise for 6 straight years as we see the financial health of Ontarians decline. And the fact that so many people are now relying on emergency food support to get by should really be worrying to all of us. Food banks, were started in the 80s as a short-term response to the recession at that time, and really were never intended to be a lasting solution. But we're seeing more and more Ontarians who are unable to afford their most basic necessities. And this is really because of a number of factors that have really contributed to making it increasingly difficult for Ontarians to improve their financial circumstances. So, even this year's report actually highlighted that it's even more difficult for someone to lift themselves out of poverty. And in fact, a child born in the 80s is actually 22% more likely to remain in poverty as an adult born in the 60s. And so just these shifts in labor markets, the dismantling of our social safety net has really created a perfect storm and forced a reliance on our services at food banks.
Some really concerning data there, Ms. Stewart. Now, let's talk a little bit more about these socioeconomic issues that Feed Ontario is highlighting as a contributor to this growing need for food banks, especially when it comes to social assistance and housing in particular. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, social assistance programs were created as a social safety net. So, where someone might go through a bad patch, have an injury, lose their job, it was really meant to be something that allowed people to get back on their feet quickly. But unfortunately, these programs have been dismantled over time. And the more and more that they're dismantled, they're no longer serving the purpose they first intended. And so, if you're someone on Ontario Works who makes somewhere around $750 a month, and then someone on the Ontario Disability Support Program where it's just somewhere between $1,200 and $1,300 a month, you fall way below the poverty line. So really being able to afford your most basic necessities is virtually impossible. And if we're looking at something also like affordable housing, at one point, Ontario was actually the leader in building affordable housing, building 1 unit per 14 people. And now it's 1 per 200 people. We've just slowed down. And so this access to affordable housing is just an increasing issue. I think everyone can feel those pressures. But for those living in poverty and with a low income, the cost of housing is a fixed cost. And many of the people who are accessing our services have less than $100 left per month after paying for their housing. So how are you supposed to pay for all your other expenses? After, you have to pay for food, transport to work, even winter clothes for your children, heat or hydro. People are having to make impossible choices between all of these expenses, and it's really not something that should be happening, which is why we've made some key recommendations in this year's hunger report on how to make change.
All right, Ms. Stewart, a quick minute left here, but can you go over some of the major recommendations in this report for the provincial government and any responses you've received from officials so far?
Yeah, we've made four key recommendations for change to start moving that needle forward. So, firstly, improving the quality of work. So, things like equal pay for equal work, instituting a livable wage. Also, improvements to social assistance, as we've discussed, doubling the financial support provided through the program, investing in affordable housing. So, building more affordable rental homes and new supportive housing units. And finally, putting people at the center of policy design. So, really including the perspective of people with lived experience at the center of policy design to make sure that it's actually accessible and addressing their needs.
And have you heard back from officials regarding these requests here?
We always are hopeful, and we believe that the government at all levels shares our vision of ending hunger and poverty in Ontario. So we have sent our most recent reports to them, and we look forward to connecting with them to discuss these recommendations further.
We look forward to it as well. Ms. Stewart, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you so much for having us.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. And when we return, we're going to be taking a look at the recent public anger in China over COVID-19 restrictions. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Chinese universities are sending students home as the ruling Communist Party tightens antivirus controls and tries to prevent more protests. This comes after crowds angered by severe COVID-19 restrictions called for President Xi Jinping to resign. Some antivirus restrictions were eased to perhaps diffuse public anger. Meanwhile, the head of the IMF told the Associated Press on Tuesday that China needs to move towards more targeted restrictions rather than its zero COVID approach. But so far, China's ruling party affirmed its strategy, which has confined millions to their homes. Well, with us now to discuss the situation in China is Dr. Charles Burton, an expert on China and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Dr. Burton, welcome back to Forum Daily.
It's great to be with you, Nima.
Great to have you, sir. So let's begin with a quick overview for our viewers of China's zero COVID policy and the public reaction so far.
Well, the zero COVID policy came in because the Chinese vaccines, the Chinese produced vaccines, are not effective against the new variants, the BA variants. And so while the mRNA vaccines are quite effective and have done a lot of good here in Canada, China has not been able to produce that kind of vaccine technology domestically. And for nationalistic reasons, the Chinese government has refused to import Pfizer or Moderna that would provide effective protection. And so the result is that the only way that they can keep COVID down is by massive programs of testing and large numbers of people put under quarantine, including people who are even contacts of people who have tested positive for COVID. So we've got a significant portion of the population that over the past 3 years has been facing these lockdowns in their apartment buildings, for in some cases as much as 100 days stuck in your apartment, unable to go out. Most of them are for a couple of weeks or a month until they get it under control. The people in the apartments, of course, are not able to go out for work. So the Chinese economy is suffering. And a lot of people who can't get out to work have no income. They can't get out and work. They have no money coming in. And they've been issues with getting food into people who are not allowed to leave their apartments to go shopping. So the food has to be brought in. So this has caused enormous pressure on people. And the zero COVID policy does not show any signs of easing up. There is no solution beyond continuous cyclical lockdowns of people who might spread the disease. And of course, there's concern that this ultimately will not work out and that COVID will run rife through the Chinese population, which would be disastrous as they don't have the medical facilities to accommodate a massive outbreak of the coronavirus.
Now, considering the implications of this zero COVID policy, what do you see as the reasons behind President Xi Jinping's maintaining this policy?
Well, he has associated himself with zero COVID and has emphasized that it's the best way for China to show a superiority to other countries by the low death rate. And so it's very hard for him to maintain his prestige as the penultimate emperor-like leader of China and revoke that policy. So the official media is sticking to it and saying that the COVID zero policy is the policy of the state and will continue until the coronavirus has been eliminated altogether.
So, how do you see this revolt against the zero COVID policy evolving? Do you see maybe a deeper uprising brewing against the Communist Party, something similar to what we're seeing in other countries, anti government protests, etc.?
It's looking that way. I mean, the current round of mass protests throughout cities in China was sparked off by a tragic incident where there was an apartment building that went on fire in Urumqi, a city in the far northwest of China. And there were 10 families who were locked into their apartments to maintain the quarantine. And so when the fire came, they were unable to leave the building because their apartments were locked and no one could open them up. So, tragic loss of life because of the policy. But I think young people in China are dissatisfied with Mr. Xi's appointing himself Party General Secretary for life. They're upset with the declining economy, the lack of opportunities for young people to get work. They're upset with censorship, internet censorship, and in general, the inability to speak their minds out. And young people are holding up blank pieces of paper as part of the demonstration to give an indication that, we cannot say what we think, or the Chinese state will arrest us. And, because of the pervasive surveillance technology in China that has, facial recognition cameras all covering all cities and very strong censorship of the internet.
NATO allies are reaffirming their commitment to Ukraine. They are saying the war-torn nation will one day become a member of the world's largest security alliance. The promise essentially repeats a vow made by NATO leaders in 2008. Some officials and analysts believe that the move was partly responsible for the war that Russia launched on Ukraine in February. NATO foreign ministers meeting in Romania have also promised more help for Ukraine's beleaguered armed forces. Well, this comes as President Xi Jinping says China is ready to forge a closer partnership with Russia in energy. A state news agency says Mr. Xi made the comment in a letter to a China-Russia business forum, but the announcement gave no details. China's energy-hungry economy is one of the biggest customers for Russian oil and gas. Purchases more than doubled over a year ago in October to $10.2 billion. This came as Chinese importers took advantage of discounts offered by Moscow amid the economic fallout from the war in Ukraine. Nearby, Indian and U.S. troops have participated in a high-altitude training exercise. This was in a cold, mountainous terrain near India's disputed border with China. The activity comes at a time when both countries are trying to manage rising tensions with Beijing. The UWA's exercise has alternated between the U.S. and India since it began in the early 2000s. This year, it is being held only about 62 miles from the line of actual control, which is a disputed border that separates Chinese and Indian-held territories. Moving to Ethiopia now, where a senior official says there is no timeline for restoring internet access to the country's embattled Tigray region. Ethiopia's Minister for Innovation and Technology said Tuesday that the restoration of Tigray's internet will be carried out alongside the resumption of its phone and electricity services. Tigray is home to more than 5 million people, and it has been mostly without internet, telecommunications, and banking since the war broke out between federal government troops and TPLF forces in November 2020. Aid workers and rights groups say the communications blackout has hampered the delivery of aid to Tigray and fueled human rights abuses there. All right, switching gears to the latest data on U.S. consumer confidence, which fell for the second straight month in November. The Conference Board reported that its consumer confidence index fell to 100.2 this month, which is down from 102.2 in October. The decline came amid ongoing high inflation, rising interest rates, and layoff announcements by several large tech companies. Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden says a rail shutdown would devastate the economy. He has asked Congress to block a railroad strike before next month's deadline. And House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says politicians will take up legislation this week to impose a deal, which 8 out of 12 unions agreed to in September. More than 400 business groups had been urging Congress and Mr. Biden to step into the deadlocked contract talk and prevent a strike. Well, China has launched a rocket carrying 3 astronauts to complete construction of a space station. The 6-month mission will be the last in the construction phase of China's Tiangong space station. The station's 3rd and final module docked with the station earlier this month. This is one of the last steps in China's effort to maintain a constant crewed presence in orbit. All right, well, in Australia, the Environment Minister says her government is going to lobby against a report which is recommending UNESCO add the Great Barrier Reef to a list of endangered World Heritage Sites. Tanya Plibersek says the report's criticisms are outdated and a reflection on Australia's previous government, which was voted out of office in May. Officials from UNESCO and the International Union for Conservation of Nature released a report on Monday. It is warning that without ambitious, rapid, and sustained climate action, the world's largest coral reef is in peril. Lava is shooting into the air and flowing downhill as Hawaii's Mauna Loa volcano erupts for the first time in nearly 40 years. For now, lava is not threatening any homes or communities, and no evacuation orders have been issued. Lava could eventually reach neighborhoods on the eastern side of the Big Island, though it could take a week or more for molten rock to reach populated areas. The mind-bending film Everything Everywhere All at Once has won Best Feature at the 32nd Gotham Awards. The honor is boosting Oscar hopes for the multiverse-hopping film. It follows Evelyn Wang as she travels throughout other universes and races to save the world. The Gotham Awards offer the first major prizes of Hollywood's award season. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you can always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also watch all of our commentary, programming, and interviews on the News Forum YouTube channel. All right, thanks again for joining us today on Forum Daily Canada, and take care.